us in the salon today. I'm Adam Smith, and I'm delighted to be back again hosting one of these sessions. I say it with that kind of sigh because I'm really keen to give people the opportunity to also take a turn at hosting one of our salon sessions. So if you're watching this and you'd like to have a try at hosting one of our weekly salons, drop me a line. We'd love to give you the opportunity. But I am delighted to be hosting today's salon session, which is all about preparing for your Viva, which we know can feel like a daunting experience for many. However, today we aim to explore how you can transform it into a showcase of your scholarly journey. And to help us in this discussion, we are fortunate to have two brilliant speakers. First, we have Dr. Donald, and I didn't check pronunciation of surnames before this. I'm going to say Lyall. Donald, are you there?
Yeah, that's it. Hang on.
We have Donald Lyall, who is a senior lecturer in population brain health and a PhD examiner whose research spans brain health, cognitive aging, and neurodegenerative diseases. And Donald is also a firm advocate for open and transparent science. Hi, Donald. Thanks very much. Next, we have Dr. Eleanor Cole, who began her role as a junior research fellow in applied AI at the University of Oxford earlier this year. Eleanor brings with her a wealth of experience from her PhD, where she examined how chronic inflammation relates to brain aging. And Eleanor's there too. Eleanor?
Hello. Hi.
Great, there we go. And so an interesting fact that I thought you might be interested to know is that Donald was actually Eleanor's PhD assessor, or one of her external examiners, but none of that was planned. They both independently offered to be salon speakers when we first put out the call for this earlier in the year. And then through the pairing process and through working out schedules and who volunteered for what, both of them happened to get put forward into this session. And it wasn't until I emailed and said, hey, I've paired you both up to talk in this salon session on Viva. Would you be willing? That they said, yeah, sure. And weirdly, they know each other. So how spooky is that? And come back, stay on the screen. Is this, we were chatting before. This is the first time as well that you've seen each other in Viva. Are you not getting PTSD, are you, Eleanor? We're not.
No, I'm not getting any PTSD. I think like the main message I want to get across to people is that your Viva is something that can be a really exciting experience, and it's kind of the payoff for all of the hard work that you've put into your PhD. So it's nice that you've done.
Brilliant. And well, it's great to bring you back to both together again. So where am I in my script? So today, as I said, we're going to dig into what it really takes to prepare you for your Viva, not just academically, but also mentally and strategically. And after their presentations, we'll open up the floor as ever for discussion. So do stay online to ask your questions of our brilliant speakers as well. And we'll have a chat. And anybody who's already been through their Viva will look forward to getting your experience. Or if you've already started preparing, we'd love to hear what steps you've taken to prepare. But for now, I think Donald is going to present first. So I'll hand over to you, Donald, and let you share your screen and get my camera.
Sure thing. Right. Well, thank you very much for having me, everybody. I hope I can slightly demystify some experience. So you can hear me all right? You can see the screen? All that
yeah, we've got your view. There we go. Perfect.
Great.
Thanks, Donald.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me along to talk to you today. I'm moderately relieved that Eleanor didn't get wind that I was the other speaker and immediately hightail it out of this meeting. So what I'm going to do today is very briefly talk you through a little bit of so I've been an examiner for a number of years now in various guises that I'll talk about, and what I'm going to talk to you about is some very mundane practicalities of doing a Viva, because there's a lot of things about a Viva that you don't actually realize until you're there on the day. And then I'll talk a little bit about the kind of mindset, because it's such there's such a variety of things that could happen on the day for your specific thesis and specific interactions you have, that it's hard to give very specific advice. So what was my remit? Adam gave me some nice guidance, which was, it can feel like stepping into a gladiatorial arena where your years of hard work are scrutinized by experts. But what if we told you that the Viva isn't just a test of your knowledge, but a performance demanding strategic preparation and psychological resilience? Today, we will challenge the conventional approach to Viva preparation, arguing that success lies in not just knowing your research inside out, but in mastering the art of persuasion, anticipating the unexpected, and turning the interrogation into a compelling narrative of your academic journey. So we'll see what we can do. So who am I? My name's Donald. I am a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow. My favourite colour is purple, and my board colleague is called Zoe. I have been involved in Vivas in a variety of ways for about 10 years now. And again, these are the kind of things that, as with a lot of academia, people aren't really told. There's often not really a course in these kind of things. So the salon, I think, is fundamentally a great thing. So first of all, the different roles that you can get in a Viva, and these will vary by different universities and countries and all sorts of things. I have convened several Vivas, first of all, and what that means is that at Glasgow, and they don't always have this in every university, at Glasgow, I am someone in the room who makes sure that all of the internal, the external, the students, potentially supervisors who sometimes are allowed to sit in, everyone's happy. All the examiners have returned their things in good time. There are no major disagreements, and that everything goes very civilly and in a timely way. So it's kind of the lowest involvement, really, the convener. And some universities, for example, Glasgow, there is one convener for each Viva, whereas some other universities, for example, I know from experience, Edinburgh, have it that there is it's more of a role that someone does for an extended period, where someone might be a convener for several Vivas over 1 year. I have been internal examiner various times, and what that means is that for the University of Glasgow, I have been basically, there are usually two types of examiners, which are internal, that's one from within the university, and there's external, and that's one that's come in from somewhere unrelated. And I've done various for Glasgow, and that tends to be not always, but it tends to be the kind of the idea is that you're slightly less senior than the external examiner, but not always. And I have externaled various Vivas. What that means is that I've come in from Glasgow to somewhere where I have not been involved in that research at all. I'm not a collaborator of either the supervisors, and I don't really know the students or their work, and certainly I'm not a co-author on any of their stuff. I have also had several of my own students pass a Viva with minor corrections. And I obviously have had my own. So I had my own PhD in Edinburgh about 12 years ago. So throughout this talk, there's the obvious content, and then in highlighted red, there is unsubstantiated opinion. So that's just what I think. My 2 cents, exchange rate varies. And then there is stuff which kind of intermediate between staid, factual stuff and my own unsubstantiated opinion, with stuff that's a little bit, well, a bit of pinch of salt here. So who are your examiners? When you go into your Viva, who are you sitting down and seeing? And incidentally, I should say these are for PhD Vivas, or MDs sometimes. So if you go into the Viva, there usually will be 2 examiners. There will be the internal and the external. And they may or may not be familiar with them at all. So in my experience, as with many things in academia, there's a huge amount of variation in who tends to get brought in for a Viva in terms of the student and the supervisors. So usually the supervisors will decide on who to approach to be internal and external. And sometimes universities have it that you cannot have any publication history ever with that person. You have no links to them whatsoever, because that could theoretically be a vague conflict of interest. And so maybe someone that your supervisor has, maybe they bumped into them at a conference and they're very nice, hopefully. Maybe it's someone that your supervisor just wants to get to know a little bit, or maybe it's just someone that's in the field, does interesting work that they think would be a good examiner. So there's a variety of reasons why someone might get asked to be an examiner of a Viva. But fundamentally, the idea is that they have sufficient expertise that they can say, yes, I am a vague expert in this area. I can tick off that this person has contributed to understanding. So, and incidentally, the unsubstantiated opinion here, with the may or may not be familiar, is that it can be quite good if, in my experience, if the supervisors have said, oh, I talked to this person at a conference, they were nice, they know their stuff, they seem reasonable, that can make your life a little bit easier. So what are their backgrounds? It can often be worth thinking about what is the background of your examiners. So if you happen to know, for example, that your examiners are, the internal is a statistician and the external is a clinician, sometimes, on average, there may be a slight bias in the things that they might be about to ask you about. So, for example, and incidentally, this is very much an on average type thing. So recently we had a Viva, one of my students, and I said, right, there's a vague expectation that, well, this person's a clinician or this person's a psychologist and this person is a geneticist. So they'll probably bias their questions that way. And that was exactly what happened. So with your examiners, you can have a wee think about, well, they're a clinician. They're probably going to be quite keen on questions like, why does this matter? How do we roll this out to the world? Whereas a statistician is going to probably have a slight bias towards questions which are more in that ilk. And again, that's a very unsubstantiated observation. What are they fundamentally trying to tick? Now, Glasgow is quite good for PhD students in the sense that you can go online and you can see all the documents that the examiners will receive. So if I was an examiner and I was examining at Glasgow, I get one web page link, and there's all these documents of like, okay, here's the form you send to the admin office, here is the list of, here's the box that you get to tick, here's the things that you're trying to do to say that this PhD only requires minor corrections or major corrections or whatever. And it really kind of, I think, focuses the mind of the student to be able to see this, because you can see what the examiners are trying to tick, what they're trying to endorse on your behalf. So this will vary a great deal between universities, but fundamentally over various universities, these tend to be some variation of that you definitely did it, which is a relatively obvious one. So that, you know, the person in front of us is the person that we believe wrote this document, that it's a reasonable amount of work for the time span. So I think if you know, you did the PhD for 3.5 years, that this is a reasonable thing to present for those 3.5 years. It's a contribution to understanding, so that you have stated the literature as it is, you have critically appraised things as they stood, and you have contributed to your field, and you've shown reasonable judgment in how your work fits into the existing literature. It's presented reasonably, that usually is quite an obvious one, and that these things are of a level that they may provide the basis for publication. So something that, whether with a bit of work or as it currently stands, could be reasonably submitted to a journal for international consumption. And often in a PhD, it's again, unsubstantiated opinion. It's very nice to be able to say, well, this chapter is already published. So whatever you might think about it, examiner, a few people think it's all right. What will happen on the day of your Viva? So this, again, extremely unsubstantiated opinion. PhD Vivas often will start at certain times for a variety of reasons. Maybe an examiner is flying in the morning. Maybe it's completely off the cuff. I tend to think that the best time to start a Viva is 10 a.m. And the reason for that is that examiners might want to meet for half an hour first. Maybe, in fact, often the examiners haven't really spoken necessarily before they actually start the Viva. So they'll need half an hour to go, right, who's talking first? What kind of questions have you got? Let's make sure we don't overlap. You don't want to start it when, ideally, you don't want to start it when you're going to be hungry. You know, so don't start it at noon, knowing that you're going to need lunch in half an hour now. The typical duration for a PhD Viva is sort of 3 hours. Of the PhD students I've supervised, the range has gone from, or that I've convened, or internal or external. The absolute minimum I have ever seen was that I convened one, which was about 90 minutes earlier this year. But that's very, very, very short indeed. Mine was about 3 hours. The longest I have been involved in was about 5. A very minor observation I have is that, and again, this is very unsubstantiated, is that the Zoom ones tend to be a little bit shorter. My personal hypothesis for this is that if an external has flown up from London at 6 a.m. to be here, they're probably all going to want to, you know, this is their day. So there's more kind of, right, we're bedded in for a few hours here. Whereas with Zoom stuff, there's, I think, a bit more of a tendency for, right, let's just do this until we can tick all the boxes and we've had a nice chat. That's completely my own unsubstantiated observation. But typically a few hours, think that, you know, average is about 3, but it will rattle by. That's a very common observation, is that your Viva rattles by very, very quickly and far faster than you'd expect. You will look at your watch and it will be 2 hours in. They may ask, or sometimes you can offer, for a 5 to 10 minute hello summary. So that's, my name is Donald, here's what my PhD was, here's what we found, here are the limitations, here's what I would do next. Thank you, any questions? You can ask to do that. Sometimes they may ask you to do that. That's a very inconsistent one. The format of these questions is, in my experience, that they will tend to be, firstly, overarching. So, right, what were you setting out to do here? Why did you do this PhD at all? What motivated you to do it? Then they tend to go chapter by chapter. So in chapter 2, you used an ANCOVA and you controlled for age and sex and deprivation. Why did you do that? Why did you not do, control for smoking? And then they tend to come back at the end to, again, rather more overarching questions about what would you do next? What do you feel is the strongest part of your thesis? What's the weakest, etc., etc. Sometimes the questions are by chapter and they will go one examiner, then the other, then back and forth and back and forth. Sometimes it's all one examiner, then the other. It really just varies. Now, from your point of view, what is a good mindset to go into your Viva with? And one thing I would say over the vast majority is try to be relaxed. Try not do anything too different the night before or the day before. You have fundamentally done the hard bit. You would not have been allowed by the university or by your supervisors to submit total nonsense that is not realistically going to get accepted. It is, the way I thought about it, even going in, was that it is it's your day. It is a birthday party that you have earned by what you've done. Because afterwards, it's essentially just a great big party about how well you've done. The vast majority of Vivas tend to get minor or major corrections. That means that very, very probably, touch wood, if you go into the Viva and you have done it and you can see how you've ticked those boxes, that you have a very good chance of coming out with this is going to be a PhD subject to XYZ, which is usually a formality. So go into it in the mindset that you have done the hard bit and theoretically, now this one varies a great deal. It's factual, but it seems to vary by university a lot. Often, the supervisors sort of will know a few days beforehand. Again, this varies by university and all sorts. The 2 examiners are meant to do their individual reports and send them to the university. And then if there are any major disagreements or any major issues, theoretically, they can talk to the supervisors about, is there any mitigating aspect to this? So theoretically, in my experience, that often doesn't actually happen. The 2 examiners often don't really share things until very, very close to the Viva often. But theoretically, that means that unless your supervisor has given you some hints, you're probably going to be good. It's going to be an aspect of just responding to the questions in a very natural way, because you do know what you're talking about, because you've been working on it for 3 or 4 years by now. So how can you prepare? You can bring your thesis along. Everybody brings them, but no one ever really tends to look them up. The questions will tend to have a mixture of, they will vary from quite philosophical and fundamental to specific minutiae. So I went into my PhD expecting, like, I went and looked up what's an F value, what exactly is an ANCOVA doing, what's this, what's that, and in the end the questions were like, who cares? Why does this matter? And I'd thought far too specifically. So you may get questions on, okay, what's method XXX? Can you tell me some limitations of that? Can you elaborate on why we use it at all? Why didn't you do an alternative? What would you do next? So that's very fundamentally, in terms of this chapter, this analysis, what would you continue on to do if you had some hypothetical data that was perfect? But fundamentally, questions will vary from quite specific and minute on particular aspects of what you've done. But then a lot of questions will also be quite conversational. There'll be questions along the lines of, how do you interpret this? What would you do next? What are some limitations of this particular approach? You can bring a crib sheet where you have lined up questions that you're almost certainly going to get. So those fundamental tenets tend to be, what was your contribution to understanding this thesis or this chapter? What was your contribution to the analysis in front of you? So for example, I used to work on a data set where I hadn't derived the imaging variables myself. Someone else had done that. So they might ask you, what exactly did you do here? What are some limitations of this particular chapter, this analysis? What would you do next if your PhD in some hellscape continued for another 3 or 4 years? And how does this relate to the literature? And it's quite a nice opportunity to say what you genuinely think. It's not necessarily the case that you are defending what you have done to the absolute hilt. You can be very contrite that nothing is perfect and that there are limitations to effectively every data source we have. But you can take time. It is a conversation, and I hope Eleanor, I really hope Eleanor backs me up on this. It's a conversation. So the questions might be difficult, but you are not under duress, and you have the opportunity to think and relax and chat about what you think some of the strengths and weaknesses of your thesis are, and what they mean, and how they exist in the context of the rest of the literature. So you can do the classic politician. That's a very interesting question, and that's a very reasonable suggestion, but I'm not quite sure perhaps that would be an appropriate approach in the future. So I have permission from Eleanor here. So this is the part of the form that I returned to the University of Edinburgh about a year and a half ago. And it includes some of the things that, so the way I do it as an examiner is I just have it open, and then I comment things, comment questions and thoughts and things I'd like elaborated. And then I put them into that form, and then I send them off, and then I have that in front of me on the day. And I just go through these questions. And sometimes they're actually answered elsewhere in the conversation, and I can tick them off. So here, for example, you can see that they vary a little bit from what do you think about this? What's your personal approach? So you suggest that assigning one key biomarker as most important is inappropriate. Could it be that there are context-specific biomarkers we haven't identified yet? So there, I just want Eleanor's opinion. You know, I'm not necessarily saying, what's the answer on pain of failing this PhD? I'm saying, what do you think? And what I'm trying to do there is, first of all, that there's critical judgment, that she can understand what she's done and how it fits into the grand scale of things, and also that she definitely did write this thesis, which is usually a very easy one to tick off. And then on the other end of the scale, there are questions where I would like to know the very factual answer to things, please. So number 3, regarding sex differences on page 46, please elaborate on the directions. So I guess there just wasn't clear to me which sex had higher C-reactive protein. And there, what I'm trying to get at is, again, that she definitely did it, and also this is a sound body of work. And like I say, because it is fundamentally a big conversation, you are allowed to say that's an interesting question, but it's hard to say for certain. The main thing really is don't be hard and rigid. Be respectful of the situation, but you can be relaxed and amenable and talk in a way that's conversational. So thank you very much. I hope Eleanor doesn't completely upend everything I've just said and say it was horrendous and terrible and I was a terrible examiner. But I am very happy to chat if anybody would like to know more.
Brilliant. Thank you, Donald. And I'm sure she wouldn't do that anyway, because I'm sure she'd follow your guidance, which is be respectful. So even when you disagree, you wouldn't say you're wrong. We've actually got some questions, which a couple of these are quite pertinent, actually. So I'm going to come to those questions before I bring in my own, which is, so Elise asks, do supervisors come to a Viva with a set of questions which they need to be worked through before you get to the end, or is there some flexibility? How do you approach that?
Yeah. So I can see them in the chat. They're all great questions. So thank you for listening, Elise. So yes, I certainly come to the Viva with a set of questions that I intend to go through by the end of the Viva. Often, for example, with Eleanor's, I found that as she would say certain things, I would be able to tick those off and say, well, actually, she's already answered that. It's fine. So I certainly go in with a set of questions that I would like factually answered. But then as the discussion ebbs and flows, there is often a lot of opportunity for genuine questions of interest. So things that weren't necessarily in the questions which come up naturally. But like I say, that will probably vary a little bit by the examiners. So certainly, sorry.
No, go ahead.
But certainly, the way various universities work is basically all of them actually that I've been external for. I have to submit a set of my recommendation to the university before I have any involvement with the other examiner or the whatever. So, for example, Eleanor's, I will have said, Dear University of Edinburgh, I think this is a pass with minor corrections. Here are the things that I would like resolved before I can endorse that. And then there's a little bit on the Viva form after, which is how were your concerns reconciled? And usually just say, well, look, they answered it in a way that was, perfectly sufficient for me. But Yeah,
So,
generally it's best to go in with a list of questions.
So just checking my understanding of the timeline for that then. So you send that letter after the Viva?
No, but beforehand.
So you read
send it to the uni.
Sorry. I see. So you read the thesis beforehand, submit your kind of questions, and then you have the Viva, and then you doing the paperwork after.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I guess it's a bit like peer reviewing a paper in so much as you go through and then, as you say, highlight bits, and then as you get further, go, oh yeah, that's been answered.
Yeah.
Exactly. Perfect. And there was another question here, which is from Angelina, which says, what goes through the mind of a supervisor when selecting examiners? What are you looking for?
So another conflict of interest here is that Angelina is actually a PhD student I work with,
Really?
who's an absurd superstar. So what goes through the mind of a supervisor when it's selecting the examiners? So first of all, I can tell you what has gone through the minds of supervisors that I have been involved with. I can't tell you what goes on in the mind of PhD supervisors full stop, because that would be a gateway to madness. I don't know what everyone in the world necessarily thinks. The variety of approaches I have seen tend to be, there are supervisors who just randomly pick a name out of a hat. There are people who have bumped into someone at a conference and they seem nice. That'll be fine. They work in the same area. And there are some supervisors who seemed to, they wanted to work with someone and this was an opportunity to get to know that supervisor. I'm probably the least a fan of the third. Really, I wouldn't do the third myself. But generally speaking, in my experience, it tends to be that they run down who have we not worked with, that we could say there's some conflict of interest here, and who seems nice and sensible. Which
I guess can get tricky if depending on how niche your field is. That there are
yeah, and you suffer if you're in a very collaborative area.
And they're always from the country of origin?
No, it can be anywhere. I didn't get to do it in COVID, but I've had one or two where I would have gone off to certain countries where you get like, it's a whole different setup and you get like a whole event and it's all quite formal. Whereas generally in the UK, it's just, you get a 4 a.m. EasyJet really. No, I think it can be really anywhere.
It can be
just any scholar who can tick that, yes, I'm a reasonable expert, that I can endorse that this person has made a contribution to understanding.
And I'll bring you one of my questions, which was, in your experience, what makes for that kind of Viva performance that stands out beyond just knowing the research?
Generally, I mean, Eleanor and really all the PhD students I have examined have been very good, where it's all been very conversational. It hasn't been rigid. And the answer to that question is that yada, yada, yada. It has been, right, we are here to talk about this nice thing that I have done for 3 or 4 years. Really, I suppose, really need to stand out per se is just if you can get to the end of that Viva and you've not had a horrendous time, and you've got PhD approved subject to XYZ, that's really the main aim. So I would say that the main thing is just try to be relaxed, try to be conversational and relatively zen.
Have you had any without any revisions? Without any correction?
No, I've not. I've heard about it, but generally
you have done, because I got no corrections on my PhD thesis.
Oh, did we? All right, well, there you go then. Well, that's the only time, and I think we nominated you for a prize or something.
Well done, Eleanor.
There you go. Was that a planted question?
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I met a supervisor at Alzheimer Europe who I can't remember how many PhD students she had, but so far she had 100% rate that none of her PhD students had any corrections.
Wow,
which has got to be a record. She didn't tell me how many she'd actually had, but there were certainly 2. Anyway, thank you very much. We'll come back and we'll have more conversation afterwards. But for now, let's get a chance to hear from you, Eleanor, if you'd like to share your screen.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Can everyone hear me okay?
Can hear you, but
you can't see my screen yet?
No, not yet.
Hang on. Let's entire screen. There we go.
Perfect.
Cool.
Thank you.
this is going to be so much less impressive than Don's presentation, everyone, I'm afraid. My presentation mostly has encouragement and advice and memes. Yeah, it's going to pale in comparison to Don's. But I want to echo everything that he articulated. Your Viva is really the time to rejoice in the fact that you've finished your PhD. You've spent 3 to 4 years working on this in relative isolation. And it's a time to talk about it with people who are genuinely interested, ostensibly, in your subject area. Don had a bullet point there that said, these might be the only people who ever read your PhD thesis. And I think that's something to bear in mind. This is something you've worked so hard on. And apart from beloved friends and family, not many people maybe are going to read this big book that you've written. And actually, it's a real joy to be able to talk in depth and scientifically and rigorously about the work you've done and that you've devoted a substantial proportion of your time and life to. I'm going to go through this by sort of talking about how to prepare 2 months before, a month before, a week before, the night before, because I think these are different stages of you like leading up to an event. And sometimes I think when you've got anything big on the horizon, you've got to think a bit like an athlete. And actually all of the work that you've done during your PhD is half of the prep. You know your PhD inside and out by the time that you've submitted it because you've spent so long on it. So actually, most of the work is already done by the time that you've submitted your PhD. I think I felt at sea for most of my PhD. It's a really isolating experience in some ways. You're doing this big, big topic that can sometimes feel quite disparate and unraveling. It can feel difficult to feel like you can draw it all together, the stuff that you did in your first year, the stuff that you did in your third year, and form it into one coherent big body of work. And actually, I think I felt when I was writing my thesis that was the toughest point. And it tipped over into a point towards the very end of writing my thesis where actually everything felt like it was coming together. Everything felt like it was a bit more motivating. Me, myself, I felt like I was a bit of a husk. I felt like I'd poured so much into this thing and I couldn't see the wood from the trees. And by the time I hit submit, that was the real anticlimax moment when I submitted my thesis. And then the time that followed in the lead up to my Viva, that actually felt like a bit of a joy because I'd done all of the hard work. And actually now it was just consolidating what I'd done, picking holes in it, seeing how it related to the broader literature and research context. And by this point, I'd done all of my big thinking, right? And actually it was what I needed was a tiny bit of time aside for looking at this thesis with fresh eyes. So I think it differs slightly between university, the time between your submission and the time at which you have your Viva. But typically I think it's like 2 to 3 months or something. There's at least a month or so break before you sit your Viva. And in this time, you need to get as many eyes on your thesis as possible. Get as many people who are willing and able to read your PhD thesis. Over the course of your submission, you'll have had your supervisors look at it, but maybe you can get someone in the department who's a bit more senior to look at it. Maybe you can get your mum or your dad or your sister or a friend. It doesn't matter who, because actually part of what the Viva is does this piece of work make sense? Is it coherent? What are the questions it raises? And is it interesting? So actually, even if it's a friend who's in a different field, in some ways, the questions that they have might be the most useful questions that you get, right? Because one of the things that Don said is you prepare for the questions that you're going to get asked, right? You spend ages thinking about, okay, are they going to ask me about this specific equation on page 103? And actually trying to think about those minute questions aren't that helpful. It's actually those big overarching questions which are the ones that are most likely to get asked and the ones that you really need to have a good answer for. So when you've got someone who's read a chapter or two, they don't have to read the whole thing, maybe ask a friend to read chapter 1 and ask if they have any questions on it. They're going to be able to tell you what's clear about it and what's not clear. And it doesn't matter if they're not an expert in this subject, because actually it's unlikely that your examiners are going to be experts in your thesis. You're likely to have 2 examiners who have slightly different research fields, right? You might have a geneticist, you might have a statistician. And actually, they're not going to be completely an expert on your topic. That's you. You're the only person who's going to be a big expert on this specific topic. Listen to the insight that you get from your supervisors. Their insight is really key. And sometimes it can feel like their insight is like too much. It feels like they're asking you to I had at one point during when I was getting comments back on my thesis where I was like, I don't know if I can handle any more comments. This is too many comments for me to handle. But that's why I've got that meme on the right there. They're just trying to help you. They know what it's like to go through this process, and they themselves will have examined other PhD theses. It's really useful to have someone look at your thesis who has both examined a thesis and who has been through it themselves. I've said senior figures there because people who have looked at loads of these are going to be your big asset, big help, because they'll have an idea of what makes a good thesis, and that's what you want yours to be. But yeah, remember that your thesis is your thesis. So take some of that advice in and leave some of it out. If the advice feels helpful, take it in. If it feels complicated, if it feels confusing, just ignore it. Just ignore it. The month before, make some time to read your thesis with fresh eyes. I want you to have like seriatim sensibilities. What I mean by that is that your examiners are going to read this somewhat chronologically. Okay, so think point by point, chapter by chapter. Go through chapter 1, and then at the end of chapter 1, write a list of possible questions that might come up, right? And even if none of those questions have come up, that thinking that you've done, that will be helpful. Think about your examiners and think about the fact that they've got this big daunting book to read ahead of them. Some of them might read it up on the train journey towards you. Hopefully not. Hopefully they spent a bit longer than that. But think about how they've got this quite overwhelming body of work to get through. And what are the questions that they're going to ask for each chapter? What's going to be confusing to them? What's going to not make sense? Which chapter doesn't quite fit? Sometimes you might have, in the process of writing your thesis, cold, entire chapters. You might have taken a chapter and then your supervisor at some point thinks, actually, I don't know if that's relevant. I don't know if that's as strong as some of the other chapters. Let's leave that out. Go through some of those old chapters. Refresh yourself about some work that you did, but maybe didn't quite make it into the thesis. Because actually, there might be a point in your Viva where someone asks, oh, hang on a second. You've done this analysis, but I noticed that you haven't done this type of sensitivity analysis. Why not? And you might be able to turn to them in that moment and say, oh, actually, I did do that. I did do that analysis. It didn't make it into the final paper because a reviewer didn't like it, or I thought it didn't quite fit here. But actually, the result and the answer to your question is we did this analysis and this happened. Right? So think about what you left out as much as what you put in. Go through those chapters by chapters. And also go through any of your work that was published or put in a preprint or anything where you've had comments on it that have already been received. So if you've got any published chapters, you will have already had reviewers go through your comments. One of the papers in my thesis had 7 reviewers read it. And actually, I went through all of the comments that those reviewers wrote. And I found those really helpful because actually a lot of those questions came up in my Viva. And not only had I thought quite hard about how I had to respond to those questions at the time, but I'd also either written a rebuttal to their points or I'd answered those points and given further analysis in that paper. So I found going through work that had already been through some kind of peer review process really helpful. Don't worry, if you haven't got anything published, you will still have supervisors and people who have gone through your work, who have made sure that it is sensible and it is robust. And think about what comments your supervisors have given you on a previous draft, where they've said, okay, you've done this analysis, but have you considered this analysis and such? Think about the comments that you've received previously and how they have led you to the thesis that you have now. What shaped that journey? What shaped that story? Much of life is storytelling, and a thesis is no different. So you've got to think about what you've covered, what you've left out, and how that's contributed to the overall narrative. But make time. Take time in your day, whether it just be an hour in the morning, to go through gently and be proud of what you've done and think about how it's going to be received by your examiners. The week before, don't panic. The biggest advice that I would have to anyone doing your thesis is that question that Don raised, where he said that you're likely to be asked to introduce your thesis for 5 to 10 minutes, right? And one of the things that I think is most helpful and that will make you go into that Viva with your guns blazing, right, is practice a 5-minute to 10-minute summary of your work. And what I did is I actually practiced 3 different versions of this. I practiced a 20-minute introduction to my thesis, I practiced a 10-minute introduction, and I practiced a 5-minute introduction. And none of that prep was useless, because actually, do you know what? You're going to be describing what you did in your PhD for many years to come, okay? So if you can find ways to describe it in different forms, in different lengths of time, that's really helpful. Think about how you tell the story of that thesis. And if you practice that talk, if you practice that 5 to 10 minutes, the rest of your Viva is going to go really well, because that's going to be one of the first questions that you're asked. And if you can go into that Viva confident of that one question, the rest of the Viva is going to follow quite smoothly. I think we go into Vivas pent up of anxiety and stress. And if you can quite early calm those nerves, you're going to feel set for the rest of the Viva, and you're going to be able to relax into it, ease into it. And then you're going to be able to enjoy that intellectual back and forth, that discussion of, you've done this, what do you think about this? How about this? Have you considered this? That is a joy. That is something that you will be good at, because you're a scientist. You've been spending the last 4 years asking those questions yourself, right? So if you can get that script set, you'll be fine. And one of the things that I did that I found really helpful is I practiced giving a speech like that, and I practiced recording it. And it's something that stood me well in my actual Viva, but it also stood me well later on, because you're always going to be having to introduce your PhD, introduce your research. You're going to have to do that in talks. And actually, if you get comfortable doing that, these things don't become a stress, they become a joy. So yeah, the night before, don't be this person. Don't stay up really late at night. Rest and sleep. You're going to perform much better. All of that memory consolidation is going to happen when you sleep. If you've done a recording, maybe listen to that and be excited. You're going to have a really good time. You're going to have an exciting opportunity to talk to some world experts about some research you've spent the last 3 to 4 years doing. A Viva is a really exciting thing. Like Don said, at the end of it, it's kind of a party. It's something that you fought for. You're going into battle, and you've done all the hard work. So don't be stressed, rest, and go into it with a positive, enthusiastic mindset. Last thing I'd say is to echo what Dom said at the end, is be curious and engage, but admit fault. So take your time answering questions. If your examiner asks something and you don't quite understand, ask for clarification of it. Get them to rephrase that question. Often when someone asks a convoluted question, it's because they haven't quite understood what you're getting at here. And that's not your fault, but it's also not their fault. But you can reshape that question slightly. So ask for clarification on what they're getting at, and don't bluff if you don't know the answer. I've got that meme there because I'm sure we've all felt like writing that sentence at some point in our research work. But if you don't know the answer to their question, think about it. You've got that intellectual ability to consider what they're asking you and to think about the things that may be relevant or maybe not relevant. But don't bluff. Don't bluff. Say, I don't know, actually, but that's a really interesting question. What I do know is this, right? You can reframe things without evading things. And at the end of the day, what your examiners are trying to do is they're trying to think about how you think. And actually, they're interested in this thesis. They've spent loads of time reading it. So they're not trying to to trick you or to catch you out with these questions. They're just interested, and they're interested in thinking about how you've put your research in the wider context of the literature and what you think. They're interested in what you think primarily. Yeah, that's it. That's me.
So much. That was really great. Your two talks really complemented each other perfectly. And the challenge for me now is that you've already answered so many of the questions that I'd prepared in advance. How long was the gap between submitting your thesis and your Viva, Eleanor?
Do you know, I can't remember. I think it was about 2 months or something like that. What I remember feeling is that I still felt so deep in this thesis that the hardest bit of preparing for my Viva was just opening it again and having to be in that world all over again. And that's where I found getting other people to read it and ask me questions about it really helpful. People are interested in what you do, and the stupidest questions are sometimes the most helpful questions I found. So if I got a friend to read it who'd never done a PhD, they'd sometimes come back to me with like really quite simple questions, and I would then be able to explain, and it gave me confidence that I actually knew what I was talking about. But it also gave me this practice of making quite difficult to understand concepts easier to explain. And then when you are able to have that conversation with someone who doesn't know your topic, when you have it with someone who knows a bit more about your topic, it's all the more exciting because they ask a good follow-up question. So yeah, I think about 2 months overall.
I read, so I just spent most of yesterday preparing a course which is now available in Dementia Researcher community called Preparing for Your Viva, where we've pulled together, we've got lots of blogs and webinars and tools and things on our website that talks to this topic, and we've essentially curated them all into kind of a bit of a systematic course that you can go through. And one of the pieces of advice in that was that once you submitted, don't do anything for 2 weeks. It was just to forget about it and just rest. Did you do that? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think definitely you need fresh eyes. You need fresh eyes. You know, you need that break. You need to be able to look at this without that feeling of dread. I said there's like, I think there's a moment of bathos or anticlimax when you press actual submit. I think this is such a big body of work, and actually that relief comes a little bit later. So yeah, but by the time you've had your Viva, honestly, the hard bit's done. The hard bit's done.
And that guidance also suggested that one of the most useful things that people say that they've had was a mock Viva. Did you have a mock Viva?
So going into this Viva, I was wary. I was wary because I had done a Master's by Research a few years before, and I had a Viva for that Master's by Research, and that Viva was almost 5 hours. Okay, so I went into my PhD Viva slightly traumatized by the experience of that Master's Viva, and I didn't have a mock Viva. What I had instead was I had dedicated people in the department who would ask me questions about chapters. I found that actually more useful. I think an actual mock Viva would have been quite stressful for me. I think it depends really on the person and what they want, but you're not going to be able to totally replicate or prepare for what questions you have from your specific examiners. And so I think if you had a mock Viva and a Viva, those two experiences might be quite different. I think the main thing is you need to practice talking out loud about your work and answering questions. So any version of that kind of mock, I think, is good.
I think I loved your suggestion of doing that. You know, if you're going to focus lots of effort, focus on that 5-minute kind of introduction, because I completely agree. I think once the nerves have calmed and you've settled in, it's getting over.
You'll perform so much better if you are at ease and you're relaxed. That's how you end up with those kind of conversations, those kind of conversational Vivas. They feel less like an interrogation. So if you've done the prep for that 5 to 10 minute thing, I think the rest of it will follow through smoothly. And that's something solid that you're definitely going to be asked a version of that question.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I suppose the whole issue of a mock Viva is often driven by supervisors who kind of want you know, they might push you towards that and help arrange it. Donald, where do you say, I mean, but I think your suggestion there of having multiple people read and ask questions is that those two different approaches both sound like they'd work quite well for some people, and also as well depending on the time and how much input you can get from people. What do you suggest, Donald, on that topic?
I think, as Eleanor alluded to, it really depends on the person and what they think they benefit from. I think, you know, I've seen people have mock fellowship interviews and mock various things, and they regretted it because it was like, oh, I feel way worse about this now, because maybe sometimes people are, you know, particularly tough on you in the mock because they want to prepare you. So horses for courses, really, each their own. That one. It can be helpful as long as people aren't. It can be helpful, or it can slightly freak you out. Just yeah.
Let me jump to some more of the questions we had in from the audience. There was a question there which says, "Is it an advantage if your chapters are published papers? Would your examiners know this, or do you need to say it?" Did you have publications from your thesis before your Eleanor?
Yeah, I had at least 3 of my chapters were published, and Your examiners probably will know that, but it doesn't hurt to tell them, and to even sort of include in your Viva questions that those reviewers raised. I think it's not essential. You like, the main thing about getting a PhD is you have to have produced a body of work that makes an impact on science, right? That is an original contribution to science. That's what distinguishes a PhD from some other types of degrees, like master's degrees. It definitely helps. But your examiners might have different questions to your reviewers. I think examiners, mostly when they see that a chapter has been published, they relax a bit, because some of the hard work has been done for them, so to say. They know that it's robust enough to get through the peer review process, but they're probably going to have slightly different questions from what your reviewers raise. So it doesn't hurt in your discussion, in your dialogue back and forth with your examiners, to say, that's a really interesting question. Actually, one of the reviewers had a similar question, you know, sort of have a conversation back and forth like that.
Drop that in, which is great to get in there, that's been published as well. And there was another question which I think might be a good one for you, Donald, which is Angelina asked, does minor, major, or no corrections depend as much on the thesis writing or on the delivery of the defense, or is it both?
So there are a variety of things which kind of contribute to this. So first of all, major and minor, often major means that we want you to go back into the data set one way or another. We want you to reanalyze something in a quite meaningful way, as a vague rule of thumb. It can also, the dividing line between major and minor tends to be, first of all, as I said, do you have to go back into the data for anything major? And B, there are so many corrections here that we think it will take you whatever that university considers as major. So for example, for some universities, minor corrections is a month. For other universities, it's 3 months. And it might be that the student would rather have major, but they've got longer to do it because maybe they're off on another job. So there is that very practical aspect to it, so that sometimes someone would say, look, it doesn't actually go down anywhere that, you know, of a major or minor or whatever. We're telling you, you've really got minor corrections, but we're going to give you 6 months to do it. And, you know, it's not down anywhere that, you know, PhD, major or minor. I would definitely boast about none, to be clear. But definitely put that somewhere. I get that tattooed. But major, minor is, it really just depends on a mixture of what exactly is it you've got to do, and how long would you like to do it in.
I was trying to find a stat. I knew I had a stat. I've got a stat here, which is research by UK university shows that approximately 85 to 90% of first-time PhD candidates pass their Viva with minor or no corrections, and only 10 to 15% require more significant revisions or face the possibility of you know, the other.
Also,
option.
it's like one of the pieces of advice that really calmed me before I had my Viva is someone said to me, practically no one fails a PhD. Like, you're most likely to get minor corrections, and minor corrections is a really broad category. So you might get minor corrections, but actually there's like quite a lot of work to do, or you might have minor corrections and it's just a few typos and a few little bits. But actually, most, like, other than major corrections, like, you're really unlikely to fail. Like, you're really quite unlikely to fail. If you've written that big book, you're really unlikely to fail. And so that, I think, calmed me a bit before my Viva, is that, you know, I'm probably like not gonna not get a PhD. That bit of advice calmed me down, is that, like, no one really fails. Like, you've done the hard work.
Absolutely. And you mentioned on the time scale as well, but you can even ask for an extension to that, can't you? I mean, if something comes up in life, you can. I was talking to somebody recently who was about to go on maternity leave, for example, when their corrections were due and they got extended. It's not the norm, but I'm assuming you can request longer.
Yeah, for Christmas and stuff. Yeah, if there's 2 weeks there. So. But yeah, like I say, often. Another factor as well is that a lot of the time with universities, with at least some universities, major is such that it needs to be signed off by both examiners, whereas minor is usually just the internal. So it's.
I didn't get through half my questions, but that's good because actually it shows you demonstrated, you'd answered them already. So my examination of the two of you, you both pass without any corrections. Well done. This has been really, really interesting. Thank you so much. I hope anybody who's watching now, we are going to jump into the chat for the last 5 minutes. We've overrun on the live part today, but that does mean there's still a chance for you to chat with Eleanor and Don to ask your questions. So do get those ready, and don't go anywhere. Just stay where you are. Click that chat button at the bottom, and we'll have that conversation online. And just to thank Eleanor, Dr. Eleanor Conole and Dr. Donald Lyall, thank you so much both for joining us. They're both in the community as well. So if you think of something that you afterwards you're watching the recording and you didn't get a chance to ask that today, you can send them a message through the community space and drop them a line. Eleanor, you should absolutely think about being a PhD coach for people. I think this could be a great side hustle. You're a very inspirational talk. I think you'd be a very calming influence for people that need that. And also as well, just a final plug, as I mentioned earlier in the chat today, we have just turned on some of our new community features, which is this training course. So we've packaged up a lot of content, which includes a few blogs, questions, some podcasts, and articles that were on our website, which we've packaged up into a training course. And you can sign up to that in the community app. It's free, it's self-paced, it allows you to work through some of that content, which you can do, and it hopefully give you some ideas. And we're going to take the recording from this session today. So if you're watching this and you're already on that course, it's because we've put it in there as well. So everybody who does that will get a chance to hear from Eleanor and Donald. Thank you so much, both of you, again. We'll be back in the salon next Wednesday, and I can't remember what we're talking about, but have a look, and we'll see you in the chat now. Thank you.
Bye.